thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. If you were with us yesterday on the program, you know that our focus was on the issue of kinship care. We learned that there are about 7,000 Vermont children who live with a grandparent or other relative, and that is a growing trend. To go a little bit further into the issue, we've asked our kin care specialist to be with us again this afternoon. I want to welcome back Joan Vance from UVM Extension and Deirdre Rizok from UVM's Child Welfare Training Partnership. Thanks so much for being with us again.
Thank you.
Joan, tell us a little bit about what kinship care is.
Kinship care is the circumstance where a child is taken care of by someone other than their birth parents. It can be family members, it can be grandparents. It's most often actually grandparents, grandmothers of either the maternal or the paternal side. It can be aunts, uncles, even siblings, sometimes grown siblings. And it can also include a category called fictive kin, because sometimes someone that the child knows well, either a preschool teacher or a neighbor or friend, coach, teacher, takes the child, and all of those things are covered under the title kinship care.
And so kinship care is on the rise. What are some of the reasons for that?
I think there are a lot of reasons. One reason is just economics. I think a lot of young people are not able to have their own independent home and move in with their parents and their children. So some of those are three-generation families, but some are families that have been impacted by substance abuse, mental illness, incarceration. Military service has been a growing and now a reducing cause in Vermont. And so all of those things, I think, play a role.
And Deirdre, what are some of the things that a person or a family should think about when they're considering being a caregiver? Because obviously it can be a very emotional time, and obviously you don't want to have your grandchildren leave the family.
There are many things to think about. Yesterday, we looked at the idea that roles change and that family dynamics are affected by kinship care, and so those are things to really pay attention to. And then we also looked at adjusted parenting, which means really looking at the needs of this child as opposed to your prior experience as a parent. And we looked at the particular needs of the child and how to really make sure that you're meeting those needs. Today I want to focus on the idea of financial impact, self-care, and other ways to be part of a child's life, and then also the rewards of caregiving. So financial impact. In some types of kinship care, there are some financial assistance, but in others there's really not. And so a lot of times a caregiver or potential caregiver will say, oh, we'll just figure it out. Well, but if you're just saying we'll figure it out and you really don't have the resources, then that can put a strain on your physical experience. It can put a strain on your emotions and your relationship. So it's really important to think ahead about how you'll manage those finances and make that money stretch to fit your new circumstances. Self-care is the other piece that is very important. A lot of times when people become caregivers, the very first thing that goes is their own time for themselves, taking a walk or spending time with friends. So it's really important to think about how you will manage that, because if your well goes dry, so to speak, then you're not only more susceptible to becoming ill yourself, you might be stressed out, you might become depressed, and you're not taking very good care of this child. So that puts the child at greater risk as well. So self-care is really important.
Is there an element, when we talk about self-care, of guilt from the caregiver, feeling like they have to provide this child with everything and they have to be everything for the child because, you know, of the circumstances?
Of course.
They have to make up for anything that's gone wrong in the child's life, too.
And they maybe feel guilty if they want to take an afternoon off or a weekend off?
Yes, sometimes. And we also know that a lot of times, particularly if these are grandparents or people that are somewhat older, their own health issues become secondary. They become secondary to the child. And so sometimes we see people whose health really declines.
And while that might have worked when you were in your 20s raising children, when you're in your 60s or 70s raising children, it's a whole other ballgame.
It's pretty critical sometimes, yeah.
And also you mentioned different ways to be part of a child's life.
You know, it's really important for families to talk together, if possible, about how they can care for this child, because it doesn't necessarily have to be all or nothing. It could be that more than one family member is caring for this child in some way. It could be that one person is really the homework person, that one person is the weekend person. So it really doesn't have to be there's one person and then everybody else falls by the wayside. So it's important to think about that. And then also, you know, the rewards of caregiving. We've looked a lot at some challenges that are involved in caregiving, but it's also important to remember that there really are rewards. You're building, ideally, a stronger relationship with this child and potentially with other family members as well. You're learning skills that you might not have learned in another circumstance. You're learning strengths that you might not have known you had. You have the opportunity to meet different caregivers and form friendships with them. And really, you have the opportunity to know that you're helping your family and friends to really transform their lives.
So it sounds like you really need, if you're going to be doing this, you really need a game plan. You need to think about all these issues at a very emotional time, I would think, but there are resources available. What can people do?
It kind of depends on what the legal status is of their guardianship, but there are a number of resources out there. I think the first thing that I would do is call Vermont Kinship parents to talk with them about what my circumstances are and what things might be available. If your child is in the child welfare system, and you can, as a kin caregiver, become a foster parent, and then you would have access to all of those resources and a social worker as well to help guide you through that. If you're not within that system, then calling Vermont Kinship parents, going on the website, finding a support group, looking at Deidre's beautiful blog, Voices at the Table, all of those things are possibilities. But I think that, as you say, the sooner the better. And we have heard very sad stories about people who have spent down their retirement when, in fact, to provide child care, because they didn't realize that child care in their particular circumstance was available to them. So I think the sooner you can find out what all is available to you, the better.
So can you make the decision to have the child go into foster care and be the foster parent?
That could be part of your decision. You would not have the choice about whether the child goes into foster care or not. The child welfare folks do that. You may get the option at the time a child is taken into custody, or even temporary custody, emergency custody of the child welfare system. You may have the opportunity to do that.
And so I guess part of the issue is, and every case is different, but part of the issue is maybe you're thinking you're just going to do this for the short term, a couple months, maybe a year. But then that's not the case.
Often we find that people thought at the very beginning it would just be for a little while. It might be for 3 months, or, as you say, maybe a year. And then that doesn't work out that way. So in the meantime, decisions have been made and things have been set up in such a way that your family maybe suffers financially, if nothing else.
Yeah, what are some of the things that people should consider right off the bat when they're thinking about being a kin care?
I think that at the very beginning, if you have the choice to talk with child welfare folks, if that is a possibility, make that decision very carefully, because there are a lot of positives to that, as well as there are pros and cons to both approaches. And that your legal status will determine a great deal about what resources are available to you. Another thing to find out right away is how much family support you may get, and what support there is in your community.
And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Something that's important as you go through this process is really ask a lot of questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't be afraid to have people clarify things. Even if they're telling you something and you really don't understand it, ask again. And also take notes. Take notes on who you talked to and what they said, so that you can really refer to that later, because you'll think you'll remember, and then it's months later and you can't remember. So,
and it's critical too to do this for the child as well, so that if you've got your ducks in order, it'll make it easier for the child as well.
Yes, it will.
And so what do people say that they need the most?
I think there are two things people say they need the most. From an agency standpoint, they really need someone to talk to about what their legal options are, what their resources are, what they're entitled to through different legal statuses. That's one thing. And I've interviewed a lot of kinship parents kinship caregivers who just at the very beginning needed to talk to somebody about what does that mean. If I become a probate minor guardian, what does that mean? What does that mean in the long term? What does that mean in terms of resources? If I become a foster parent, what does that mean? And for all of those questions, those are sort of long-term questions, long-term impacts that, as you say, you might be in an emotional state when the decision comes to you. But it's important to get as much information, as Deidre says, ask until you understand it. That's one thing. And then from a standpoint of when you have care of a child, the one thing people need the most is a break. They need some respite. And there are some respite programs that are paid for throughout the state, but those may be difficult to access either because they're not available or because the time doesn't work. So if you have a family member who is a kin caregiver or a friend or someone that you know and you know that child, offer to take the child, give them a break. They need a timeout.
A couple hours, maybe a weekend.
A weekend would be wonderful. A couple hours would be great.
And where can a person find a support group?
The VCAP website is a great place to start. There are support groups throughout the state, and there are also individual caregivers who might be willing to talk with families as well.
And so earlier this month, you were both part of the Vermont Kin as Parents Conference. What was the focus of the conference and why?
The conference was called Parenting Revisited, Enriching the Journey. And so we really looked at the stories of children who'd grown up in care and then also caregivers. And we looked at the needs that families have and then ways to support those needs. So there were some great workshops, a lot of great dialogue. It's a wonderful experience.
And what did you hear from people? What were some of the needs that they talked about?
I think one of the things that we often hear from people is the questions that are part of the adjusted parenting issue. I think that when people begin to care for a child that's had trauma, they're surprised by the child's reactions to things that are maybe part of an everyday experience that may trigger something in the child, or you use the same sort of discipline. As Deidre says, a timeout may not work. You may need a time in. The children have very different reactions to what would have been what you customarily did, and I think people are always very happy to get information about what it means to take a child who's had some difficulties or some early trauma, and that really helps them to just understand that this is different and why.
Now, Deirdre, you're with the UVM Child Welfare Training Partnership. Tell us a little bit about the partnership and the work that you do.
Sure. The partnership is a collaboration between UVM and the Department for Children and Families. So we educate and train foster, kin, and adoptive families, and also the professionals who work with them. So we offer classes throughout the state, we consult on a variety of issues, and really we work with other child welfare professionals throughout the country and throughout the world. So we have a lot of access to resources for families.
And so just to recap a bit, kinship care is growing, and why?
Kinship care is growing both for legal reasons, because there are both state and federal laws that require agencies to look first for kinship placements when a child comes into custody. But it's also growing for reasons, economic reasons, and because of growth in substance abuse issues, mental health issues, and those sorts of societal pressures.
And so what are the key things that kin caregivers need to know?
I think the most important thing for people to know is that they're not alone, and that there are people and organizations that can offer support in a variety of ways and that really want to help. I think kinship care is really, it's a little bit like a river. Sometimes there are really scary moments and some swirling eddies, and then at the same time there's really beautiful scenery along the way.
That's nice. One more time before we close the program, where can Vermonters get information about kinship care?
Vermont Kin as Parents website is a wonderful thing to look at, vermontkinaparents.org, and then voicesattetable.wordpress.com is also.
And what is Voices at the Table?
That is a blog that I oversee, and it's for kinship, foster, and adoptive families. It has articles, it has parenting resources, it has access to classes throughout the state and online.
And so when you get that call, if you get that call, the most important thing to do is what?
Ask questions. Ask as many questions as you need to. to get the information that you think you need to make that decision. And I would say the second thing to do is, if you have family support, gather it now.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.